Hello, House of Blessing Church. Oh, I really miss getting together with everyone, seeing all the people, seeing all the different kinds of people that make up our church family. I remember the very first time I visited a different ethnic group. It was in America, but the people who I was visiting were not Americans. They spoke Spanish, and I didn't understand a word. Their houses smelled strange. They were generous and offered me food, but their food smelled strange. I decided that I didn't even like it before I tried it. Honestly, I was kind of afraid of these people because they were different than I was, and I didn't know what they were talking about. After the Old Testament had ended and before the New Testament began, the Jewish people endured some pretty brutal treatment by other ethnic groups. As a nation, the general feeling toward other groups was extremely negative. To a Jew at that time, if you weren't a Jew, you would probably be considered a Gentile dog. Sitting down to a meal with Gentiles was unthinkable to the common Jew. They saw themselves as God's people and everyone else as God's enemies. But is that how God felt about Gentiles? That is, the people who aren't Jews? I recently taught on a section of Jesus' ministry in which he and his disciples set out on a retreat to take a break from the crowds. If you saw that video, you may remember how the retreat was canceled by a large crowd of people who wanted to see Jesus. And remember, he had compassion on them and chose to heal them, help them. But they still needed a retreat. Today, we're going to see what lengths they had to go to in order to get away from the crowds of people there in Israel who wanted his healing touch. In Matthew chapter 15, Jesus and his disciples went way out of their way to have their retreat. They left Israel and headed for the area of Tyre, that is Gentile territory, where he wasn't so famous, in hopes of getting away from the crowds. Mark tells us that he entered a house and didn't want anyone to know it. But someone did notice. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me! My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." It seems the disciples had the standard Jewish feeling for Gentiles at the time. They said, "Send her away, send her away." But Jesus listened to her. As she knelt before him in worship and prayer, this is how he answered her. "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." "Lord, help me," she said. "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." Whoa, hold on. Did Jesus just call her a dog? Does he think Gentiles are dogs too? Let's continue. "Yes, it is, Lord," she said. "Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed at that moment. When I taught this story in my Bible study, several people asked, why did Jesus call her a dog? Did Jesus really feel this way about Gentiles? We have to continue to find out. And as we do, keep in mind what Jesus said about throwing the children's bread to the dogs. They were in Gentile territory, and they didn't really return right away. By comparing Matthew and Mark's accounts, we can tell that Jesus and his students did not return directly to Israel. First, they went through an area known as the Decapolis, a Gentile area. Some scholars believe they probably spent as long as 6 months total in Gentile territory before returning to Israel. Not much is written about that time, but I want to point out one story from their time in the Decapolis. Jesus had a large group of Gentiles following him. How did he feel about being followed by Gentile dogs? Well, he taught them. He healed them. And as a result, Matthew writes, the people were amazed, and they praised the God of Israel. That's not all. It was about time for him to send the crowds home and return to Israel. Look at what he said to his disciples. "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I don't want to send them home hungry, or they may collapse on the way." The disciples' natural response was, "Where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd?" Do you remember the conversation earlier with the woman about throwing the children's bread to the dogs? At that time, he was talking about God's grace to the children of Israel, that is, the Jews. Now, they're in the Decapolis. Jesus and the disciples were the only Jews around, so He took literal bread from the only children of Israel around, did a miracle, and had his disciples feed it to these 4,000 hungry dogs. Well, by this time, we can see that Jesus doesn't see Gentiles as dogs. He had compassion on them. How about his disciples? How did they feel about serving their lunch to Gentiles? Well, it's hard to say. Matthew doesn't record their feelings at this point, but eventually, they also went to foreign lands to share Jesus' teachings. As followers of Jesus, he instructs us to do as he did. Maybe you're like I was before. Going to different people groups, ethnic groups, it's uncomfortable. There are strange languages and smells. Maybe if you're honest, there's fear underneath the surface. Sometimes we have to obey God's instructions with our hands and feet before our hearts can follow. That's to say, you might need to show his love with your actions before your heart feels it. Eventually, I learned the language of these people, and I thought they were so strange at first, and I volunteered in a Spanish church. It was uncomfortable at first, honestly, but I am so thankful for that experience. I want to ask, what ethnic group or social group makes you uncomfortable? Are there any from that group in your area? Right now with the COVID restrictions, it may be difficult to contact other kinds of people, but I think Jesus would challenge us to go out of our way to find someone from another ethnic or religious or social group and to show an act of kindness. I did, and I'm so glad for it. I hope this challenge actually comes true. You'll be so blessed for it. God bless you, church.